I'm Ari Redbord, and this is TRM Talks. I am Global Head of Policy at TRM Labs. At TRM, we provide blockchain intelligence software to support law enforcement investigations and to help financial institutions and cryptocurrency businesses mitigate financial crime risk within the emerging digital asset economy. Prior to joining TRM, I spent 15 years in the U.S. federal government, first as a prosecutor at the Department of Justice, and then as a Treasury Department official, where I worked to safeguard the financial system against terrorist financiers, weapons of mass destruction proliferators, drug kingpins, and other rogue actors. On TRM Talks, I sit down with business leaders, policymakers, investigators, and friends from across the crypto ecosystem who are working to build a safer financial system. Today, we're going to be talking to Vanessa Kargenian, Director of Research at the Fidelity Center for Applied Technology. But first, inside the lab, where I share data-driven insights from our blockchain intelligence team. TRM's blockchain intelligence team recently released a report titled Beyond Fentanyl: Cryptocurrency's Role in the International Synthetic Drug Precursor Market. The TRM report found that the U.S. fentanyl epidemic is just one node in a vast network encompassing most of the world's trade in illicit synthetic drugs. Today, the factories producing most of the world's fentanyl precursors also manufacture and sell the key ingredients for almost every other common synthetic drug sold in European and Asian markets, and a significant number of them are located in China. Cryptocurrency use is becoming increasingly prevalent in this international precursor trade. In our latest report, we found that 97% of the over 120 Chinese precursor manufacturers offered payment in cryptocurrencies and received over $26 million in cryptocurrency in 2023. Between 2022 and 2023, the amount of cryptocurrency deposited into wallets linked to Chinese precursor manufacturers increased by over 600%. And more than doubled in the first 4 months of 2024 compared to that same period in 2023. For more insights on this global epidemic made in China, check out TRM's report, Beyond Fentanyl. All right, now let's sit down with Vanessa Kargenian. I have a very special guest with me today, Vanessa Kargenian. She is the Director of Research at Fidelity. And Fidelity has, as we've all seen over the last few years, really been a leader in sort of how traditional financial institutions engage with digital assets. So Vanessa, incredibly excited to have you on the show today.
Thanks. I'm very excited to be here.
Let's start with you. How did you end up in this role, in this space? What's the origin story, the superhero origin story?
I wouldn't necessarily classify myself as a superhero, but the origin story goes back to, so I've been at Fidelity for about 4 years, but prior to this, I was actually at the New York Fed for about 7. So when I first joined the Fed in 2013, some advice I was actually given from someone who had been an alum of the Fed and had gone on and done well in finance was look for something new. And basically, I kind of fell into this. There are a couple of things. I heard about Silk Road collapsing, read an article about that, and was like, what is this underlying Bitcoin thing? A friend of mine I started my career in California, and a friend of mine actually knew Ross Ulbricht from Facebook. He's like, we weren't friends. I was like, he goes, oh, to a guy I know from Facebook just went to jail. And I was, what is this Bitcoin thing? And so started looking into it, right? And reading about it. Similarly, at the same time, I was a little underutilized at the Fed. I was doing liquidity modeling and had a little bit of bandwidth. And so my claim to fame was I gave the first Bitcoin presentation at the New York Fed in particular in 2014, early 2014.
That's amazing. And was that just like, hey, this is what it is?
Yes. This is what it is. What is this there's an underlying technology to it. It was literally a brown bag kind of lunch presentation that I did for one of the teams. And then that actually connected me with a couple other people internally. They're like, hey, if you like these new technologies, there's actually a couple others. But at the time, there were only 8 of us across the Federal Reserve System interested in this blockchain thing. And that sort of just started the process of actually being really interested in newer emerging technologies. So not just blockchain, but AI and others, and thinking through like, what is that impact on financial markets and kind of operations in that sense. So that sort of led to where I ended up being, for most of my career, I was dual hatted. So for the first 2 years of the Fed, I was like, it was sort of do it in addition to your day job kind of thing. So I helped lead like an internal working group on blockchain where we did a 2016 paper on what is blockchain's potential use in clearing and settlement. But if you go back and find that paper, it's kind of funny now because we're just focusing on the Bitcoin blockchain because it was at a time where Ethereum or other chains really hadn't taken off yet. So I had the privilege of doing a lot of firsts and within the Fed system, but it was also kind of convincing top brass that we should actually kind of look more broadly at technologies in this sense. Finally, we kind of had some buy-in and it was a little bit more blessed. And so instead of doing it in addition to your day job, it was sort of like part of my job. So for the last 5 years, my day job was cybersecurity IT bank examiner for the really big banks like JPM and Goldman, looking at traditional cybersecurity risks such as like insider threat risk or third or fourth party dependencies. But then the fun, everything I said fun came as being a fintech policy advisor. So sort of anything new with that other folks didn't really understand, I got to kind of go in and do that.
That's amazing. I mean, like, so I think people maybe not appreciating the story is like really, I mean, this is early, right? 2014,
Yeah.
really, really early days here. And the fact that even, 8 people throughout the Federal Reserve System is not as outrageous as it may sound. But obviously you grew in this role at the New York Fed because we did start to see a explosion of different digital assets, of more blockchains. And you had this sort of role as you were advising, senior officials within the organization. Talk to me a little bit about that. Like, how did that role evolve?
It was good. It evolved. It was patch fueled, like to some degree. So sometimes I feel like, the Fed sometimes gets a bad rap, but I think the Fed, they have really good people. They have really strong senior leadership that wants to think about things in a great manner. And so we naturally are a little bit more conservative. And so I think sometimes I was viewed as more of the young gun coming in that's, oh, you just want to change things up and want innovation. So you had a little bit of that where I think you fit across like just in general, different companies might feel that just because it's new and it's changing the guard. But you also had a lot of senior people that were interested and kind of willing to think about it. So you had a wide range of depending on who you're talking to. I had one person who was a senior at the very, very early days. Senior said, I'd rather you go home and spend time with your family than look at this, which kind of threw me off because she had been acting as more of a mentor. But then at the same time, I had one of our head risk officers say, like, tell me more. You had a big spectrum, but I think what's important to note is it wasn't as if we were completely ignorant. The senior management wasn't ignorant to it or kind of, sometimes people would think, oh, they're always one step behind. You still had smart people thinking about it. It was just a matter of more of a timing issue of like, when do we do something? When don't we? And I think the tipping point in particular comes, there were a lot of years, like I even remember when fintech became a term because it sort of solidified, hey, okay, maybe what you're doing actually has some legitimacy. And so like little wins like that. But then it wasn't the tipping point coming, when we always talk about fast forwarding to like where when Facebook tried to come out with Libra, that really was a big point. It was just like these little wins of like evolving and just trying to keep a pulse on it while still, doing your day job in this. So it was like a little bit of a balancing act between the two. Like that's kind of how it evolved.
It's really extraordinary. Like, I've done a lot of TRM talks, quite frankly, almost 100 now in the last 4 years.
That's amazing.
And I can't even tell you how many times Libra comes up in the conversations I have with folks. It's really, and I say this almost every time. And I had Dante from Circle on recently, who was part of the original Libra team. And it's like, it is a watershed. I was at Treasury when Libra happened. I jumped on a plane with the undersecretary. We went to Switzerland to meet with Swiss regulators because that's where the license was and that's where it was being registered. It really was a watershed for regulators all over the world. And it just can't be overstated, the impact it had. All of a sudden, this crazy internet funny money had the backing of the world's largest companies and 200 plus million Facebook users. And it really caused regulators to think, I mean, is that what you experienced at the Fed as well?
Yes, I think so. And I think it was, but I think this question, I think we're still grappling with it too, like, right? In this question mark of like, how does this is something that's big that sits outside of the financial system and that we can't kind of, how do you deal with that? Right. And so I think there's some interesting talks now as we're thinking about how like this next version of the internet shapes out, like, or just even if you set aside blockchain, but like if you think about where the path we're on of how like big tech will come under regulation or kind of cloud providers in that sense.
Was there a point when you're sort of doing this policy work very early and at a pretty high level where you're like, hey, I want to build, like, I want to go to a place that's actually thinking about how to integrate digital assets into the financial system. Is that the move, or are there other factors going on?
Yes, no, that was actually the move. I really, my first thought was to maybe try to stay at the Fed and kind of see something in public service. I think my background is more in policy and economics, so I think that's where my nature is always going to reach first. But yeah, at some point, I think you have to the better policymakers I think have experience kind of in the real world, and I was very lucky that this role came up at Fidelity. So I was kind of the weird person that switched right at the beginning of the pandemic. So I sit within Fidelity's internal think tank, which is at Fidelity Center for Applied Technology. It's like a research and development arm. And they needed somebody to own the future of money research. And that just sounded fun. Like it just was, it's instead of being dual handed, I can go full time kind of doing research. I mean, I can go talk, I can write and think about this. And that was just kind of the shot in the arm. That's something that I wanted. It was more of a just not being dual handed.
Fidelity is one of the most sophisticated, traditional financial institutions in the world when it comes to how to engage with digital assets. But that obviously comes with a lot of R&D, a lot of experimentation. How is this a incubator in some respects for sort of the work that Fidelity is doing?
So my joke is I just bang my head against the keyboard and hope a report comes out that our senior leadership likes to read. But in reality, yes, Fidelity has a lot of moving parts, and we have a lot of expertise across this. So this where I sit is Fidelity Center for Applied Technology. So it can best be thought of as the research and development division of Fidelity. It's kind of like an old school Bell Labs. It's been around since the late 90s, and it really is intentional of trying to think through how do we use new technology. So we have a blockchain incubator, we have AI experts, we have a quantum team, we have VR headsets, like you name it on the tech, we have somebody working on it from a technologist perspective. I'm just in awe of like the talent that we have. My team is the least of the applied. We are the internal think tank. I'm a director of research in the think tank where I own the future of money kind of Web3 blockchain adoption. So how it sort of works is like our team. So I work kind of closely with our blockchain incubator, which is they're the ones that are the experts that are kind of doing proof of concepts and testing out the technology, sort of kicking the tires to decide what capabilities might we want, and then thinking about how do we maybe commercialize that and kind of transition it to a different business unit. So, for instance, Fidelity Digital Asset Service (FDAS) was spun out of the blockchain incubator. So that's a whole different business unit that custodies our Bitcoin and Ethereum. And also, it's kind of like where he handles kind of anything kind of crypto. So if you hear sometimes like Chris Kuiper is our director of research in that aspect, his audience of who he's writing for are more investors, whereas I write mostly quarterly for kind of our senior leadership staff, trying to be 3 to 5 years out, which, as you know, is impossible in crypto and blockchain. And so that sort of plays then as other business units are kind of thinking about different projects on crypto, whether it be, tokenization or just different elements at a high level, bringing different products to market. I sort of sometimes am brought in as an advisor in that sense.
Vanessa, what I'm picturing is this, center of people walking around with like VR headsets and thinking about blockchain and AI. How do the ideas that are being incubated, percolated at the center, find their way into Fidelity products?
No, that's a great question. And honestly, if you did come to Boston to see it, we do actually have a robot that would greet you at the door. Her name is
I am
Chloe.
so
So
in.
I can certainly set you off on a tour. We call it the egg, but it kind of
Oh, I'm
showcases
psyched
a
to meet
lot of
Chloe.
like the different some of the different projects that some of the different teams do, like whether it's kind of via AI or virtual presence, kind of proof of concepts and or in just general. But it's pretty neat actually.
I feel like we're burying the lead here. I need to know more about Chloe. What does she do?
She's a robot that once you come to
Okay.
the third floor, she can greet you and take you to like if you don't know where a conference room is, she can take you to the conference room. You just follow her. She can show you where the restroom is. It's actually kind of cool. I've used her because I'm actually based in New York, not Boston. So sometimes when I first went in there, I actually didn't know where I was supposed to go.
I'm
Yeah, it's
picturing
kind of
Rosie from the Jetsons.
yeah, it's kind of like that actually. And then some of our other like I think that they are actually planning like doing some more like advanced like robotics tests, like I think out of our China office. So FCAT, Fidelity Center for Applied Technology, think about it more, it's the research and development arm of the firm, right? And so it's kind of like an old school Bell Labs. And think about we have about, I think, 400 technologists that range in kind of everything from there's a blockchain incubator, we have AI experts, we have a quantum team, we have a VR headset team, as I was kind of talking about. And so how it relates is to anything that's kind of new in regarding different technologies. they're going to be kicking the tires, thinking about where can we use it? What are the capabilities that might kind of be able to be used from this? And when you ask the question of how do we get from kind of this center, this research center into kind of products, it's sort of a handoff. This is supposed to be where we kind of test and where we think about things. And the point is to eventually commercialize, but it hands off to different business units. So we will work with like different business units or we'll spin it out. So for instance, Fidelity Digital Assets, which is kind of our arm of crypto at Fidelity, was spun out of the blockchain incubator several years ago when we kind of knew we had to have dedicated teams to kind of custody Bitcoin, Ethereum, and kind of other institutional investments in general.
From my experience over the last few years, when I got to TRM 4 years ago, we were seeing what I would call sort of the early days of like traditional financial institutions engaging in the space. And what was interesting, and I think this is still true today, that financial institutions are at every financial institution in the world is at some stage of their like crypto digital assets journey. Everything from like, hey, should we bank this crypto customer, all the way to the way more sophisticated players like Fidelity, like Goldman, like JP Morgan, others who are, leaning in a little bit more, offering crypto assets, custodying crypto assets. What is it about Fidelity, do you think, that sort of puts it in that second group?
I think it comes down to senior leadership, honestly. We had, so our former chairman, Ned Johnson, was the one that set up the center back in the early 90s and had that foresight to kind of say we need to lead into technologies. And that's carried through with our CEO, Abby Johnson. She is very interested and has been interested in crypto and blockchain since a very early time, like kind of 2012, 2011 kind of time frame. And so I think it all comes down to like leadership and kind of wanting and having that support of saying, in order to not be disrupted, we need to understand new technologies.
That's fantastic. Walk me through sort of like the last maybe year or so. What have you seen internally that has really kind of, I think, taken us even a step closer towards what I'd consider sort of integration between traditional finance and this sort of new blockchain ecosystem?
Yeah, I divide the industry into two places, right? The aspects of like the digital asset and kind of the financial asset kind of classifications and where are innovations in that sense. And then kind of what can the technology do from an enterprise perspective. And I think what's changed kind of within the last 6 months or even last year is there's been a refocus on trying to figure out what can and can't the technology do. And so I think that's where you're starting to see it. As you know, it's a slow kind of process to kind of put the pieces together, but there's been just interest in kind of broadly tokenization. And that kind of means using blockchain platforms or kind of in that sense. And so I think that's where this melding of we're still interested in what can the asset class do, but it's no longer just about that. It's also about how can we support the infrastructure underneath it.
How do you see this space ultimately evolving? I think in the very early days, there was this sort of like, at least this ethos around like rip and replace, this sort of, this is going to be a new financial system. I think we've gotten to the point now where it's pretty clear that it's going to be an integration.
I think that's the right way. I think it's an alternative is the best way. Instead of a rip and replace, it's an alternative. And I think we're just trying to figure out right now where those alternatives are. So that leads us to then thinking about what are the capabilities that we actually want to use? Is it sort of the instant settlement aspect? Is it some sort of micropayment element to it? Is it some sort of programmability that like allows us to do things in a new way? And we're only just starting to scratch the surface on that. And so I think that's where it's going to be for in the long term. I think that's where we're past the days of 2016 where it's just public versus permission change, right? I think this question mark now is it's under the guise of everything we do, at least within finance, there's sort of come around to it, like to that regulatory compliance is really important. And so now I think while big companies like Fidelity and others have always sort of had that, and there's been startups that have also thought about that as well. Like I think everyone's mostly buying into that you have to let's do things in a regulatory compliance. So how do we design for that? And I think that's pushing us towards or going to push us towards enterprise adoption. That's going to be mixed. It's going to be a hybrid. Sometimes you might be using on-chain stuff. Sometimes you might be using off. And that's the part that I think is still, to me, it's exciting.
You and I had a really great discussion recently about some work that you were doing in the sort of thinking through compliance, anti-money laundering, illicit finance related issues. As you know, that's what we do at TRM and always sort of a part of TRM talks. How are you thinking about those issues today when it comes to your work at Fidelity, whether it's leveraging new technologies, whether it's, thinking sort of about a future state here where, you're going to need more of these types of tools as you go deeper into the sort of blockchain technology space?
Right. Yeah. So no, I've been focusing on this. And I know you and I have talked about this, but like I've been mostly, I think if you look at my research, what I've been doing in the last kind of year or so, I've really been trying to focus on enterprise blockchain adoption. And what does that mean? Is it kind of, are we working on public chains? Is it working on permission chains? But just how do we begin to incorporate this into kind of a technology architecture aspects of it? And I think when you think about it from that perspective, one of the biggest hurdles is how do you mitigate illicit finance and fraud concerns? And so I don't know if it's super new and enlightening, but if that's a hurdle that we can begin to overcome, then I think that's going to further accelerate adoption. And one of the things that I think has been exciting is that we're beginning to see some sort of like we hear a lot about how AI and blockchain are complementary technologies, but we're beginning to see some sort of like integrations where maybe AI is helping to enhance fraud detections in this, and you're seeing this kind of incorporated in part, as well as you're beginning to see some sort of on-chain verification that's being specifically built for know your customer, and to help sort of offload some of those kind of aspects. So you're seeing that happen on chain a little bit now. And so while it's still super early days into how you're doing it, I think that along with this perspective that now it's sort of unlike the early days, regulatory compliance isn't necessarily a terrible word or thought. I think that's overall pushing us towards the industry. And so we're thinking about it. Obviously, we have customers, we're a financial institution, you have to comply with like regulatory aspects from compliance aspects in that sense. But more of my research has just been like, let's take a step back and look at where are these kind of signals coming together. I do think over the next 18 months, then like this will be continue to help just accelerate overall.
Really awesome answer. And what also is striking to me about the conversation today and that answer is like how many different aspects of this space that you're working in. Before we actually started recording today, we were talking a little sports. You mentioned being a soccer player, which is amazing. I think we were joking. You were saying something about like, that you run, but you'd much rather have a ball in front of you when you're doing it. Tell me a little bit about that.
Oh no, yeah, well, I just know you're a big runner, and so I always say, yeah, I'm actually more of a jump roper if than a runner, but yeah, but I like basically any sport, and so I was teasing him that if we ever did this, if we needed to do an interview on skis, I'm all in for that.
Well, next time I will get you to run with me at a TRM running club.
All right,
I'll bring a soccer ball that you can kind of kick along with us to make sure that you're like feeling vibes there.
sounds good.
Thank you so much for the conversation. Like I think it's so critical to see this sort of adoption by traditional financial institutions and the way traditional financial institutions are engaging. And obviously Fidelity is leading the way. And really, I think the research that you're doing is enabling that in so many respects. So just really thank you for that. Thank you for the work you're doing. And thank you for joining TRM Talks.
Yes, thank you. It's been a pleasure.
It's interesting over the course of my 4 years, and I can't believe it's almost been 4 years at TRM. I've talked to a lot of financial institutions and representatives from financial institutions. And what I could say definitively at this point is every financial institution in the world is at some stage of their crypto journey. Should we bank crypto customers? Should we offer crypto assets to customers? Should we tokenize real world assets? Should we issue tokens ourselves? And talking to Vanessa really hammered home the point of sort of like, this is what really sophisticated traditional financial institutions like Fidelity are thinking about the space today. And, I loved her description of sort of the work that she's doing, the research that she's doing, this sort of center where, fintech can really flourish. Hey, these are the ways that Fidelity is thinking about what the future of finance looks like. And, it was very clear for me from that conversation that tokenization, engaging with DeFi, some of the sort of really, thornier, more interesting questions are ones that Fidelity is really grappling with today. So for me, I think the really fun part of that conversation was talking to really someone who's truly trailblazing, right? Someone who's in the middle of a giant traditional financial institution, yet is thinking about technology in the really, really most sophisticated ways. Next on TRM Talks, I sit down with Peter Kerstens of the European Commission to discuss MiCA, the marketing crypto assets legislation in the EU, and the move towards implementation. If you love the show, leave a review wherever you're listening to it. Follow us on LinkedIn to subscribe to our newsletter, The Weekly Roundup, to get the latest news on crypto regulation, compliance, and investigations.
TRM Talks is brought to you by TRM Labs. the leading provider of blockchain intelligence and anti-money laundering software. This episode was produced in partnership with Voltage Productions. The music for this show was provided by Ecolix.
Now, let's get back to building.